Hi, I'm David Gregg, the director of the Rhode Island Natural History Survey, and you're watching a recording of the November meeting of the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership. This month's guest speaker is Ethan Tapper. He's written a new book called How to Love a Forest. It's got a perspective that I and I think other members of the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership haven't heard too often before. So give a listen, see what you think, buy his book, and give it a read. The Rhode Island Natural History Survey presents videos to showcase the animals, plants, geology, and natural systems that surround us, and the people and organizations working to understand and conserve them.
Hey, I'm Ethan Tapper, and I am a consulting forester and a few other things from Vermont. Uh, Thanks so much for having me, everybody, by the way. I actually had a really fun time. I've been on this like crazy book tour since my book, How to Love a Forest, came out in September 10th, and I did get to do a little swing through southern New England and yeah, and got to spend a lot of time in Rhode Island. I hung out with the folks from the Tiverton Land Trust, did some events in like Providence area and the Cape and Martha's Vineyard. It was really neat. So I got to see a little bit of the forest that you all work in. And yeah, I think the reason that I'm here is because in this work of being a forester, I think I'm a little bit of a unicorn. And what I mean by that is that for the last few years, I was working initially right out of school as a consulting forester, and then I got this job as a county forester, which in Vermont, the county foresters, what we call our service foresters. And I did that for about 8 years, from 2016 to June of this year. And one thing that struck me was that, I had this, as all of our service foresters do, really, you have this charge, right? Like you're just supposed to help the people figure out how to care for forests and understand forests. Uh, and in doing that, you also still want to be like a forester. So I also had the charge to take care of about a dozen town forests, municipal forests, covering about 5,000 acres. And I really wanted to like go out there and do this work of, helping these forests become more resilient and more biodiverse and demonstrating good forest management. And, as much as I wanted to go out and just like put a paint gun in my hand, like I used to do when I was a consulting forester and just do good forest management, I realized that with my role, that it really didn't make sense for me just to go out and do that. That I really need to think about opportunities to leverage this work to help people really better understand forests and other ecosystems and what it means to care for them. Because one thing that's interesting about foresters is that, we're doing this work, which is, in many cases, multi-solving, like accomplishing all of these different things at once. We're dealing with these forest health threats. We're helping forests become more resilient moving into the future. We're helping to care for species of concern and, to deal with stuff like non-native invasive pathogens. We're doing all this stuff at once. And we're managing for all these things that everybody loves. In many cases, we come from a place of such profound love and care and compassion for these ecosystems and are trying to like manage them for all this stuff. Um, and we don't do a good job of talking about it all the time. And we don't do a good job, even when we do talk about it, of like actually reaching people where they are and how they consume information. And I think that part of that is just like an idiosyncrasy of who foresters tend to be. I think that 99 out of 100 foresters probably got into it or stay in it because they like being alone in the woods, and they just want to go there and put their head down and just do their good work. And I was realizing that with that attitude, we were missing so many opportunities to help people understand the work that we do. And one of the pitfalls of that is that the work that we do as forest stewards and forest managers is like super, super nuanced and it's confusing and it's counterintuitive. I mean, who could ever think, what reasonable person would ever believe that you could cut a beautiful tree and it could be something that's positive for these ecosystems. And yet it's nuanced. And I think that what I really started to realize was the need to spread the word of like the work that we are actually doing, which I view to be not an extractive endeavor, but something that's really about, how we care for, how we steward these ecosystems, which are facing such complex challenges in this modern world. And so with this book, I started writing this book, by the way. It's been such a long journey. This book, I've never written anything like this before. It's really a narrative book and it's very personal and it's about my relationship with forests and my land ethic. And, it sort of posits a little bit of a more complex way of looking at these ecosystems than what I was experiencing. Uh, and when I started to write the book, what I was really realizing, in walking in the woods on hundreds of parcels of land with thousands and thousands of landowners, and I think in my time as a county forester, I did like 300 public events. I was noticing these very consistent misunderstandings about forests and forestry. And the biggest of them was just this idea that, like, if we love and care for ecosystems, the way that we show that care and that compassion and that love must be to leave them alone. And I think that that's a perfectly reasonable thing to believe. And I think that that's something that is actually really profound and beautiful at times. But also, there are times when, and many times when, these forests actually really need a lot of help. And when actually, like, not stepping away and, saying we're going to just remove ourselves from these forests, but instead engaging with them and managing them and doing stuff like cutting trees can be these profound acts of care and compassion. And there's this sort of dichotomy, right? Like over here, the perception is that these are the people who love forests, and the way that we love them is we protect them from ourselves, right? We leave them alone. And over here, the perception is here are these people who are doing stuff, who maybe are cutting trees or they're killing deer, or doing some confusing, counterintuitive stuff like that. And that those must be people who just don't care. Uh, and in this book, what I really try to show is how, yes, these two things can be true. And also, there are times when actually taking action can be such a profound act of love and can be something that is not a compromise, but is actually a completely necessary step to protect these ecosystems that are dealing with all this stuff at once. One of the things that's really interesting in talking to people about this also is helping people understand like where we actually are, right? So, I think that a lot of people, they have this idea that forests are these pristine, like utopian places, that they are just perfect and that every forest you go into is doing just fine, and they don't maybe realize some of the really profound legacies of land use on our landscape, especially the agricultural clearing of the, in your case, 1700s, my case, more like 1800s. The fact that many of these pastures are like 60 to 100 years old, that they bear little resemblance to the forests that actually covered our landscape for thousands of years, with all of these conditions like big trees, like deadwood on the ground, like these historic fire regimes, like multi-generationality, these forests that have many different sizes and ages of trees, that not only defined what it meant to be a forest on this landscape for millennia, but are also the conditions to which all of our biodiversity is adapted, right? In the midst of a biodiversity crisis. And so I think that, we have a sense, most people have a sense when they walk into our modern forests of what like a normal forest looks like. And they may not understand how the forests that are normal on our landscape or that we consider to be normal actually are completely abnormal. That when we think about the span of like the forests, and as I say forests, I'm inclusive of not just the trees, but all of the living things that live there. that forests have been totally different than that for basically the entire span of their evolutionary history. And then let's add to that the fact that so our forests are young and simple, recovering from these legacies of the past. That in this moment, in the present, they're dealing with this incredible volume of threats and stressors all at once, right? So things like non-native invasive plants, animals, insects, pests and pathogens, deer overpopulation, forest fragmentation, deforestation, pollution, all of the effects of climate change, altered disturbance regimes, drought, and inundation and storms of increasing frequency and severity, all of those things at once. And then moving into this future that promises more of all of that stuff. So it's one thing when you sort of like go into the forest and you're like, I'm in nature. This is perfect. This is beautiful. This is some self-sustaining system that will just be totally fine. But when you actually start to peel apart like where we are and where our forests are at, it starts to seem unreasonable to, in every case, ask them to just go their own way and expect them to continue to provide all of these incredible benefits, not just to every living thing on our landscape, but to ourselves as well, right? And so the book, I was sort of thinking about that, and then this book emerged over the course of about 6 years. I just started to write and figured out that the time when my brain is the most productive and creative, the best at writing, is the first hour of my day, 5 to 6 a.m. And I just started writing for an hour every day. And, it'd just be like tap, 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 drinking my coffee, uh, and then close the laptop, 6 o'clock, go work in the woods. And it was just a remarkable thing to see it sort of add up to what it's become, which I hope is a book that speaks to not just the specifics of the forests and other ecosystems here in Vermont, but which posits this much more complex and nuanced land ethic that I think is applicable to ecosystems everywhere. Um, so I want to, if I may, share a little bit about myself and sort of how I came to be here. So one of the fun things about doing all these book events and getting to talk to people who are interviewing me about it and be on podcasts and stuff like that is that they always want to know like how'd you get into this? And I think it's a funny thing because, and by the way, I think it's something that we as a community should be sharing more of because I think it's really a really important part of how we help people understand like how we got into this. In the case of foresters, a lot of people think that we got into this because we just must like love cutting trees and we must just hate trees, right? And like that's how we got into it because we hate trees so much that we decided to make a profession out of it. And that's not the case for me or any forester that I know, right? So the cool thing has been that like a superhero, I have gotten to like define what my origin story is, right? In my case, it's different than the stories that I've heard of all these like nature journalists, nature writers, and famous, biologists and ecologists, where they almost always are like, I was the nature kid. I was out there and I was like crawling around the dirt looking at bugs, and I was tracking deer and catching frogs, and that wasn't my experience at all. I grew up in this little village called Saxon's River in southeastern Vermont, and it's little. It's like 300 people surrounded by forests, but they weren't important to me at all. And what I really remember wanting to, what I really wanted and what I was really excited about in that time was that I wanted to get out of there bad. And I remember telling someone my junior year of high school, I said, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont because everybody goes there and I'm getting out of here. And then I got a letter the first month of my senior year of high school that told me I got this scholarship called the Green and Gold Scholarship. It's a full scholarship. And I was like, guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. No principles, no integrity. Just decided to go and do it. But even when I got there, didn't know that forestry was something that I wanted to study at all. And I was just kind of bumping around, looking at different stuff. and taking different classes kind of randomly. And what happened is that my high school girlfriend, the first big love of my life, as I was finishing up my second semester there, she was getting back from this program that she had done, this wilderness expedition. And it was like this 5 month thing. And she came back and she had had this like huge, expansive, life changing experience. And I had not. I'd just been like playing beer pong in my hotel room or whatever, or my dorm room or whatever. And and we weren't connecting. And I thought we were gonna break up. And I was 18. So I was like, well, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go on a wilderness expedition. And the next one left in 2 weeks, and it was 6 months long. We were gonna ski north for 3 months and then build a canoe and canoe back down. And in retrospect, I did this for no reason. The relationship didn't work out, but it totally changed the course of my life. And after that, all I wanted to do was just be in the woods. And I worked as a wilderness guide. I lived in this like uninsulated yurt with a fir bough floor in the woods of Maine for a year. I worked with draft animals. I got to do some draft horse logging. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I had to come back or I was going to lose my scholarship. And so I remember sitting on the bow floor of my yurt and looking at a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont. And I scrolled down to forestry and I didn't know what it was, but I knew that it had the word forest in it, truly. And I was like, well, I'll try that. And of course, it ended up being a really good fit. And so I've realized, since then, I've realized that my journey, from a place of not caring about forests to a place of, where I was after all of those wilderness experiences, which was a place really of being like, all we got to do for these forests and for nature is just to leave it alone. And anybody who did anything to these ecosystems, in my mind, was doing something wrong. Uh, you know, that position really, I think, has put me in a better place to understand where people are coming from when they have that attitude. I get it. I've been there. But then what happened is I went to forestry school. And what forestry school did for me was really to inject so much nuance, that stuff that I mentioned a few minutes ago, about like, yes, these forests are beautiful. And yes, they make us feel a certain way. And yes, they may seem to be perfect. But actually, when we dig into it, when we study them, when we see what they're dealing with, the reality changes. And, there's something so special about studying forestry because unlike some of these other disciplines, where you're an entomologist, right? And you look at bugs, or you're a biologist, or you're a ornithologist, you look at birds, or you're a mycologist, you look at fungi, right? Foresters are sort of responsible for all of that stuff, but for no one part of that in particular. We are really responsible for this entire ecosystem. And so we have to know about things like soil science, and we have to know about things like hydrology and botany, biology, dendrology, all of these different things that together, collectively, describe this living system, this community. And when you get to study all that stuff, it's really neat because you start to see the relationships between those things. How they knit together to form these incredibly diverse and complex and dynamic and beautiful living communities. And there's another thing that's really unique about studying forestry, which I think is really, really special. And what that is that we are a discipline of action. So imbued in us is this idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them, that we can see what's going on, and then we can do something about it. And I think that that really is an attitude that still I carry with me, this idea that we can be humble enough, right, to really understand these ecosystems and to really care for them and to see all of these pieces and parts and all these elements of history, their past, their present, and their future. And then we can be brave enough to like take action. And so after that, got my job as a consulting forester, service forester, and then in my current role where I'm again a consulting forester. And really throughout all of those experiences, I believe have had a number of different experiences that have, I think, uniquely equipped me to carry this message. And so the thing that's unique about, I feel like, this book, right, is that it's not an admonishment of past management. It is not like apocalyptic vision of where we are or where we're going. It's a book that's about hope, right? And it's about love. I say that it's a love letter to our forests and other ecosystems. It's a love letter to biodiversity. And it's a love letter to a world that doesn't even exist yet. And it's the world that we can create if we're willing to make all of these complex and bittersweet choices to deal with all of these problems, to help to care for and protect these ecosystems, which are dealing with so much stuff right now. And I think that that's such a, in and of itself, is such a powerful way to communicate to people, let alone like the words that we use and the techniques that we use, which I would also be willing to talk about. I've spent a lot of time kind of trying to figure out how to reach people using different language and using different techniques. But just to bring this idea of like hopefulness and pragmatism to these conversations, I find to be incredibly powerful. And I really, have in walking in the woods with again thousands of people, I've found that it engages people in such a different way. And so I really wanted to bring that story to the public with this book. And the other thing that I really wanted to do is something that I started to do with these public events, which is that I think about it as building trust. So what we do is, I would be going to do an event and it would be on an active forest management project. There'd be a logger there, there'd be all these trees that have been cut down. And at the beginning of those events, I would always like really try to tell people who I was very clearly and how I care about these forests and how I love them intrinsically, value them intrinsically. And I believe that they have the right to exist. And, show people how like I'm a birder and we'd see some cool bird and freak out about a cool bird and talk about how beautiful I think that fungi is and talk about, all of these different uh, things to show them really where I'm coming from. And then my hope is that then we build a trust where they can appreciate that I'm someone who cares deeply about these ecosystems and that trust will carry through when then I go and show them those stumps and I go and show them this work that's very confusing and jarring and counterintuitive. And they I hope will be forced to accept at least the possibility that that could be not something that is antithetical to how much I love these forests, but something that is an expression of that. That this is something that is done by someone who really just cares about these ecosystems for their own sake. And this is what I'm doing, right? And this is what I'm doing for all of these really important things that we care about and that it's our job to protect, like biodiversity, like ecological integrity. Um, and so I had a really good um, teacher in thinking about this stuff. And this is the last thing I'll say and little story. And then I'd be happy to take any questions that you have of this, and this is something I talk about in the book a lot. So my teacher was uh, a piece of land, the forest, that became my land about 7 years ago. And it was a place called Bear Island. And the special thing about Bear Island is that when I got there for the first time, it was the most degraded forest I'd ever seen. And I had this experience actually where someone was, my buddy was like, "Hey, did you see this piece of land on this realtor's website in Bolton?" And I was like, "No, I hadn't seen it." I looked it up, and it was like 175 acres in Bolton, Vermont. And there was just a picture of this iconic mountain called Camel's Hump, as if to say, put your mansion right here and you can look at Camel's Hump, right? And it was pretty cheap, and I was kind of like, what's wrong with it? And so I went to go take a look. And the first thing I noticed, I was driving on the access road, it hadn't been properly stabilized, and there was a ravine cutting right down the center, and I was straddling it with the wheels of the truck. I rolled up onto the log landing, this clearing where that picture had been taken from, and it was covered in trash. Bags of household trash, busted pieces of equipment like partially buried in the earth, hydraulic hoses and cables and buckets, tires. It was just awful. And going out from it in every direction, this network of these logging trails, skid trails, that were like with these 3 foot deep ruts, just carrying murky water down the mountain. And it was not a very good place to start. But I was like, I'm here, might as well go take a walk. And I started walking up this main trail, and it was incredibly steep. I was getting covered in sweat, picking ticks off myself. And I was walking and walking and walking, and something was bothering me, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. And I realized after about an hour that what was bothering me was there were no healthy trees there. And it was a pretty jarring thing to realize. I started walking around, and I was just like, yeah, no healthy trees, no healthy trees, no healthy trees anywhere. And what I now know happened is that it had, 30 years before, the previous owners, this timber company, without a forester involved, no supervision, and just told these loggers, go cut every tree bigger than 10 inches in diameter on the mountain. So it's an unethical practice that we call diameter limit cutting, which is really a part of this bigger practice, unethical practice that we call high grading. So high grading is where you go into the forest and you cut only the healthiest, most valuable, high grade trees, and you leave all the less healthy, less valuable, low grade trees standing. And so they've done basically the inverse of what any of us would ever do in any system of reasonable or rational or compassionate forest management. And the best example that I can give you is that it would be like if you went into your vegetable garden in the middle of the summer and you just weeded out all the vegetables. It was like that weird, that much of sort of the inverse of anything we'd ever want to do. And so I was like, whoa, this is messed up, and kept on walking. And then I saw, even in places where there was enough light to regenerate, some trees that they were all getting browsed by deer. So there's evidence of deer overpopulation as well. I slid down over these cliffs that bisect the land from west to east and right down into a 30-acre patch of Japanese barberry, this non-native invasive plant, 3 foot tall, pure, no native plants. And I was pushing through that and go back to my truck, and I said, forget this place, I'm out of here. And I left. But sure enough, over the next couple of months, I started to think about it more and more, and to wonder if that place was actually beyond hope. And I actually ended up going back a second time. And the second time I came back, I found all these amazing things. So I found that there were actually some healthy trees there after all that were just so hidden by these masses of unhealthy trees that I hadn't seen them. And I found that there are all these plants that I love, like lowbush blueberry and sweet fern, pink corydalis and red columbine and serviceberry, maple leaf viburnum. And I found that there were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was standing on one of those rock outcrops when I said to myself, I'm going to try and buy this place. Never bought anything like that before. So when I got down off the mountain, I called my former boss, this guy Mike, who sold forest land real estate. And I said, Mike, there's this piece of land and I want to make an offer. How do I make an offer and how much should I offer? And Mike said, well, let me ask you a couple questions. So, does it have any timber on it? And I said, no. And he said, any real estate potential? No. Is the access good? No. Could it be a sugar bush? No. We kept on going down the line. It was like, no, no, no. And eventually he said, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Just offer them like basically nothing and don't be afraid of hurting their feelings. And so that's how I became the owner of this piece of land, Bear Island. And it's such a catalyzing place that really, brought together many of the ideas that became this book because it's one thing to think that, um, everything will be fine. All we got to do is just step away from these ecosystems and nature will take care of everything, right? And it's another thing when you're standing on that log landing in a forest with no healthy trees, watching thousands of years of soil roll down through those skidder ruts, in the midst of the worst non-native invasive plant problem that you've ever seen, a forest without a future, and a deer overpopulation and a changing climate, a forest that's lost multiple tree species to non-native pathogens, all of these things. And I had to ask myself in that moment if it would be a greater kindness to that forest to leave it alone and hope for the best, or to do absolutely everything in my power to try and make it healthy again. You know, Not every forest is as degraded as Bear Island, but because of some of these things, these non-native invasive pests and pathogens and plants, animals, because of that land use history, because of our changing climate, every forest I walk into is degraded, and the vast majority of them would really benefit from a little help. And I think that it's something that we need to understand about this moment that we have an opportunity, right? Which is to not just be the species that screwed all this stuff up, but to also realize that we're species with some incredible tools and some incredible power that we can also use to help them heal. So in my healing of Bear Island, I had to do all this stuff that I never thought would be part of my life. I taught myself to ride excavator and restored those skid trails that were completely unsustainable going up to the top of the mountain, built new, more resilient trails. I taught myself to be a hunter, and tried to reduce that deer population by hunting as many antlerless deer as I can every single year. There's a certain parody that I like about the fact that, 30 years ago, these loggers using these pieces of log equipment we call cable skidders, probably timberjack cable skidders from the late 1970s, early 1980s. They came to this land and with their chainsaws as well, right? And created all these problems that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to fix. And now, some of the most powerful tools that I have, powerful tools of healing that I use on this land are my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder and my chainsaw. And there is another example of something like that used in one way can degrade ecosystems and used in another way can help them heal, which is ourselves, right? We know that we have caused all of these problems that ecosystems face, but we also can be these profound sources of healing. And what I tell a lot of people when we get into these discussions about what is the role of people in our landscape and what can we do and how can we help these ecosystems heal, uh, you know I try to put them in the mind of what it would be like if you were a parent and you had a child who was sick, and maybe the medicine or the treatment that they needed was something that you thought you'd never have to use, or that you didn't like, or maybe that you didn't agree with ideologically on some level. You would do it anyway, and we all would, and in this moment, that kind of love, the ability to push through this stuff that makes us uncomfortable and to do it anyway, and to use these tools, even if they're not perfect, uh, I think are going to be some of our greatest assets as we try to figure out how to build a better world. So there's a lot to that, and I go into what I've actually done in a lot more detail. Happy to talk to you about that as well in the book, but I think that it's been so interesting to bring this message to so many different people. I think it's different. than the messages that many of them have heard before. There's a lot of books about how ecosystems are cool, and there's a lot of books about how they're in trouble, and there's not a lot about like what we actually do about it. And my favorite people to talk to about this book have been young people like late teens, early 20s, who I know that we give a hard time to. And as we maybe do to every incoming generation of people. Uh, and the cool thing about them is that I had this realization that they have been just raised and lived their entire lives with the knowledge of ecological catastrophe and climate change and a biodiversity crisis, and all this stuff has just been with them their whole lives. They've been aware of it their whole lives. And they're less interested in having people tell them that and more interested in like what do they actually do about it. And so it's been really cool seeing those, especially those young people, get fired up. Um, and yeah, I think well, there's a lot more that I could say, but I see that I'm a little bit over the time I said I was going to talk. So I'd love to talk to you more about any of this stuff. We can talk about the book. We can talk about Bear Island. We could talk about communication strategies, social media. I know is something that always people want to talk about, and that's something that I believe that I've sort of cracked in my own world. Communication, language, whatever you want to talk about, I'm happy to discuss.
Awesome, Ethan. I'm gonna put us back in the grid so we can all see each other. I'd love to lead off with a question about social media and communication strategies. So when talking about utilizing all of the tools at your disposal or in your toolbox, and your successes figuring out the way to sort of crack that code, reach young people using social media, I feel like that's something that we could learn a little bit from, to discuss how we all think about forest conservation, but also forest stewardship and moving into this future. So any hot tips, tricks, thoughts,
Yeah,
just
a
about how
couple
you got
different
going?
things.
And yeah.
So here you want to know one of the interesting things about my work with social media. I should also say that like one of the things I'm trying to do as also part of my business is to like consult with NGOs and government agencies and stuff because we all know that we're not the best at communication all the time. I don't think that I'm like talking out of school to say that. And whenever I say that at a forestry conference, everybody's like, that's true, which is you know, just the way it is. And you know, there are these tools that are like really powerful. And here's a, so I've been sort of like building this proof of concept through my own social media channels. And here's one fact alone that will tell you how important it is. So when I'm doing these public events, I feel like I do an in-person walk and the median age is like 65, right? And I remember going to like the annual meeting of the Vermont Woodlands Association and turning to my friend and colleague David Paganelli and being like, we have a demographic problem, right? It just is that we are not good at engaging young people in general as a conservation community. Uh, on social media, on my Instagram, which is my biggest page, 50% of the people are between the age of 24 and 35 who engage with my content, which is talking about all of this stuff. So I think we need to recognize, and this is something in my other communication strategies that I've really realized, is that different people consume information in different ways and in different places. So if we're only providing information in, a couple of different ways, then we're going to be necessarily limiting ourselves to people who happen to engage with that kind of stuff. People who will attend an in-person walk, people who will read an article, right? And there's a lot of people who will not. And so I think that it's really important that we utilize all the available modalities just to reach people, and to get some of these important messages out. And so my one hottest tip, this is my hottest tip on social media, is that everybody that I talk to who works for an NGO or a government agency wants to do social media. And all of them are paralyzed by the idea that uh, they will make bad content, right? Or they won't make enough content. bad content and not enough content are both better than no content, right? Like what you're doing right now, or I don't know anything about what you all are doing with social media, but what like I see in the conservation community in general is people just not doing it. And if you're not out there, there's no way for you to reach people. And, if you make like a video that's not the best, it's not going to be any worse than nothing. It'll be a little bit better. I would also say that it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. It doesn't have to be, every video gets at the entirety of every situation. One thing that I've really learned is that I've started trying to make all my videos less than a minute. And when you do a video that's less than a minute, you have to have a lot of trust because you have to trust that uh, people are going to be able to not receive every single piece of information, and that it'll be okay. That they'll be able to like fill in some of these blanks. They'll be able to like the world's not going to fall. The sky's not going to fall. The world's not going to end if they don't have every single little nuance of the thing. And yeah, but I think that that's the biggest thing. And one of the things that I really, in the same way that I'm like with these walks and with this book, trying to demonstrate how much I love these ecosystems, and then have built that trust for when, I show people these kind of counterintuitive things that I'm doing. I think that the social media is also a really good opportunity for us to show who we are and to show our personalities so that we can build that trust with people so that then when we invariably are doing stuff that maybe is a little hard to understand, it's not just us, the amorphous whatever agency or the amorphous organization or person or profession that's doing this stuff. It's like real people who have real values and probably values that we share, really. So I think that that's really important. That's another reason why it's really important to do.
Thanks. Paul Roselli.
I have a question. I'm cherishing every single word that you're saying, and thank you so much for all that you do. Certainly your journey on all of this is both inspiring and a little depressing too. We all perhaps need to get to that stage one of these days where we actually go out and buy the damn thing and then do something about it. Uh, I'm a little curious on public funding for types of projects that you might be working on, and how you balance the idea of public funding with the needs of the forest.
Mm,
We all love the idea of hiking, love it. Public funds come into play, and all of a sudden the hikes turn into walks and lots of people roaming around where they probably shouldn't, or the proliferation of things like ATVs and dirt bikes and on and on. So in your messaging or in your journey, when and places that you've been, when you talk to people about public funding, what else do you say?
mm. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, um, I haven't done that much with like big pots of public money. I mean, the closest thing to that I often deal with is these NRCS cost share programs through like Equip. We know what that is, right? Um, and which doesn't come with that many strings attached, right? You got to do the work. But one thing that I'm really interested in, which I think is maybe a little bit of a departure, is that there is something that's pretty amazing about doing forest management commercially, right? Which is that it generates its own funding. Um, and so that's something that I think is something that often gets a bad rap in the public, and people, misunderstand it to mean that if this work is commercial, that it must be solely about harvesting, money. And resources and extracting them at whatever cost. And in my experience, all of this management that I'm doing for old growth characteristics and forest bird habitat and climate resilience and, all of these different things, I've always done it all commercially, pretty much, working with loggers, selling wood. And I really had an experience, and I know this might parallel a little bit with your experience in Rhode Island. I went down to New Jersey, and in New Jersey, uh, I was talking at this forestry conference for the New Jersey Forestry Association, and the foresters there were like, "Yeah, there's basically no loggers, no mills, no markets." And so the result of that is that all the work is non-commercial. So it's either relying on these NRCS grants or landowners just paying for this work to be done out of pocket, right? Which you might be like, sure, but then the result of that is that they are doing like a fraction of the work that we're doing here in Vermont, which is a state which is a tenth the size, right? There basically nothing is getting done because what I realized is that the fact that we can do this work commercially, that it cannot not just like pay for itself, but also like generate income, generate renewable resources, is actually a real asset because it allows us to do this work at scale. And I can have a logger, an individual logger, doing 100 acres of ecosystem restoration in a winter, right? And how much would that cost to do non-commercially? $100,000? Who's going to do that, And so I think that that's something that we need to start viewing, not like, I feel like restoration and like commercial management is often viewed as things that are like almost oppositional, and they are not. They're two things that can absolutely be compatible, that can happen at the same time. And I actually view like a healthy forest products economy as being a key tool in being able to do this kind of restoration and healing work at scale. So I think that, that's something that is really interesting to think about because that really changes. When we think about, I want to do restoration work on this for 100 acres or whatever, and get all this public funding. And then suddenly we have all these strings attached, and maybe we have to change what we're doing because it's a little bit of like a square peg in a round hole thing, and it comes with all these other things. But we can also, a lot of this work, not all of this work, but a lot of really important ecosystem restoration work, we can do commercially, and we can generate local renewable resources, and we can generate income, and it can pay for itself, and we can do more of it.
That's a good segue for, I mean, I have a lot, this is really interesting. Thanks for talking to us. I have all kinds of ideas bubbling around in my head, but the one that's a good segue for where you just were is your thesis puts me in mind of a book by Gene Logsdon. I don't know if you've ever encountered him. It's called The Contrary Farmer. And sort of the premise of it is Gene Logsdon farmed a small farm in Ohio and did a lot of writing. But the premise is that whatever the agricultural agent tells him to do, he does the opposite. And he said that, he basically sort of says that sun shining on dirt produces, like a 3.5% return a year. And as soon as you take out a loan at 6% to buy a tractor, you have to make up the difference in your soil. You have to take the rest of the other 2.5% out of your soil. And so it's non-sustainable. And what I think is what I'd like to hear you comment on is about how the economic pressure that you were just talking about can tip upside down sort of your whole idea of how to manage. I mean, if you don't need to, pay the bills tomorrow, yeah, you can do it slower. And we heard a couple of months ago in the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership about how if we aren't producing all the wood we consume in New England, we're essentially exporting our overproduction to somebody else's forest. So I'm really curious to hear about how you work with the economics of it, if it has to be economical.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is something like I feel like that's its own skill, really, which is being able to like figure out a way to do the work that you want to do in the woods while like adhering to these markets, which inherently have like nothing to do with what you actually want to do. They're just like their own thing, and figuring out how to balance that. There's a couple different ways of dealing with that. I mean, one thing I would say is that most of the landowners that I work with, that I worked with as a service forester, and that I work with now as a consulting forester, if you were to do like one of those like what do you call those like maps where all the different words are on them? What are those called? Word clouds. A word cloud of like what people's objectives are. There would be one giant phrase in the middle, and then all these little ones around it. And the one giant phrase in the middle would be, I just want to do a good job. You know, and they don't, most of them don't know what that means. And most of them are just like these landowners who, you know, they just want to be a good forest steward. You know, they don't have this a big economic objective. They just want to do the right thing. And so that's cool because it doesn't necessarily like put us in a position where we have to like maximize return, where we make money, we produce resources, but only within the context of like the goals and objectives that we have for these other things. I haven't been in a lot of positions where I've had to like make big compromises for money. Because a landowner is so, is like go make me this amount of money. Never in my own business. The only thing is, you know, I think the biggest compromise is just that to make a job commercial at all, like you have to be willing to cut some big trees, and then you start to realize that that's actually, it's hard to do. Like when I was in forestry school, um, I didn't never wanted to cut a big tree, basically. And then, you start to realize that not only is that like those big trees also get to turn into something else beautiful, which is wood, but then actually like the conditions that we want to create in these healthy forests are not just like a bunch of big trees, right? We want there to be big trees in the forest, but if we look, for instance, at our old growth forests, we see that they are equally defined by, not just big trees, but by that multi-generationality, by things like dead wood on the ground, by these other qualities that can be created by cutting big trees. So that when I started to think about it that way, it made me a lot more comfortable with that idea. And then it's just sort of this this skill of being able to, look into the forest and to see what you want to do to make that forest healthier and more diverse and more resilient. And then to filter that through the realities of loggers, markets, and things like that. But I haven't found it. I haven't found myself needing to make many big compromises really. And I'm sort of a mind where if I had a landowner who was, demanding that sort of thing, I probably just wouldn't work with him also. Um, but maybe someone would.
Ethan, just really really interesting, to hear about your journey and professional, evolution, and a lot of things that I'm reflecting on as a forester. And you were talking about the speaking engagement with the group that's an older crowd, and wanting to reach younger folks as well. Are there any other sort of moments or things, that you kind of recall during stages of your career as standing out that are really an aha moment, or that changed your way of doing things, whether it was work in the woods or, how you talk about it?
Yeah.
Just curious about that.
Yeah, a few different things. I mean, so I had this moment with I was doing this forest management project, which by the way, I'm trying to reform the language that I use as well to better reflect the work that we're doing. So like I've trained myself not to use the term timber sale, which some of you may have heard of, which does such a disservice to the nuanced work that we do in the woods when we manage forests. So I say forest management project. That's what I'm talking about. And just do these events. And I was like really I described it as trying to make myself unavoidable. Like I was trying to really get in people's spaces in any different, by writing articles, by being on the radio, by being on TV, by like doing all these public events, so that no matter where people were, that they would be forced to deal with, that this thing is happening. Because that also, by the way, is very powerful. People do not like to be surprised. And so if you make sure that they're not surprised, that takes a lot of the bad feelings out of it right there. But also to message that this is not something we're ashamed of. This is something we're proud of. And we actually want you to engage with it. But we do these events and I'd be like, come do a walk with the county forester. Come do a forest management walk. And you get like 10 people, 12 people. And the next time you get 12 people and 8 of them are the same people. And the next time it's the same. And then I did a walk and I called it a wildlife walk. And I had my friend Andrea, who's a biologist with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife there. Otherwise, same walk when we got 40 people. And I was like, it was very interesting because I was like, okay, so there's a thing where people have like a trigger in their brain that flips when they're like, forest management walk, no, no, I don't want to check that out. Walk with the county forester, no, I'm not interested. Wildlife walk, oh, I like wildlife, and it like flips the trigger that's like, I'm going to go to that. And I still believe, and I still believe that this is true, that I would rather have someone show up to one of these things, even if they're mad, than sit at home and just think whatever they think about the work that we're doing, which is usually at best incomplete. Uh, and yeah, and so I started framing every single walk that I did with a different little hook. So I never did just like walk with the county forest or forest management walk again. I would do, I would do birding walks, managing forests for bird habitat. We have this program you all probably know about, Foresters for the Birds program. I'm an Audubon endorsed forester, which I became largely for educational purposes. And then the birds got me and I became a real birder. Um, there's no turning back. So, uh, oh yeah, managing forests for carbon and climate change, tree identification, right? Like you start to realize these things that have these little hooks that you frame a walk within that context, and maybe you bring in another person from another organization that can speak to some other of the aspects of that individual thing you're talking about, and then you go do the same walk that you wanted to do, where you're looking at this forest management project, but it engages different people and it engages people in a different way. And then I started to think about also like partnership, when we have these like our typical like conservation community partnerships that I would partner with for these events, and later for like media and video and things like that. And for us, it would be like the Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Land Trust, Audubon Vermont, Vermont Coverts, University of Vermont, those typical people who are like in our coalition already. And then I was like, I was at the co-op in Burlington, City Market Co-op. And I was like looking up, they have these screens and they have all these events and they have like cooking classes. And I was like, huh, I like, I know that you guys like to do these cooking classes and stuff. How'd you like to go out on an active forest management project? And talked about how it appeals to many of the same values, right? It's about localism and, producing these renewable resources and all of these other things that are totally in line with the values of that organization. And they were like, sure. And so we started doing a twice a year walk with them on these active projects. And then I saw there was a group of these two LGBTQ plus organizations, Outright Vermont and Pride Center of Vermont, that do these walks called Pride Hikes. And I was like, they do these Pride Hikes. I wonder if they'd like to go out on a active logging job. And again, talking about these values that we share. And they were like, sure. And we started going out, every year and doing a hike with those organizations. And it really made me think about how many different people are out there who, are different organizations who are completely in line with the work that we're trying to do. And no one has ever asked them to be a part of it. right? I think about this as broadening our coalition. And it does two things, right? So it like helps us engage with these other organizations that we're aligned with. And also helps us engage different people, because if someone's like, well, I don't think I like forest management, but I like the co-op, or I like Pride Center of Vermont, it sends a pretty strong signal to then be partnering with those organizations and, breaking through that wall of whatever it is, distrust, or just, not knowing about a thing, or not being aware of the nuances of this work we do. So yeah, those were powerful experiences, and it made me really change the way that I do these educational offerings.
Thanks. That's a lot of helpful context and some interesting stories about your experiences.
Wolf.
So, what would you say to the professional societies on how we can get out of our echo chamber and silo and better deliver a message, especially to young people, to get involved with this profession? Because the forestry, as a younger forester, not many people are getting into this. We're running out of the workforce. The workforce is getting older, it's retiring. It's almost as if, as our forests are transitioning and being put into these difficult situations, we are also losing the workforce to do the work. What do you have any input or insight on how we can motivate more people to get involved on the professional side?
Yeah, no, I mean, a bunch of different ways. I mean, I think one thing is just trying to reach them, right? By using these other like using things like social media, which is how whole generations of people receive information, and providing, giving visibility to our work. Because I have heard that same thing that you just said all the time, and I have probably 3 young people a week reach out to me to tell me they want to get into forestry. And I think it's just like because I'm just there, and maybe providing a little bit of a different vision of like what maybe they think a forester could be, and talking about it in a little bit of a different way, and framing it as something that is in that way makes it more accessible and exciting to more people, right? And I think that that is something that we need to do, and so that involves both like just changing the way that we just reach out and that we interact with the world, right? Through like putting our stories out there in a different way, and putting ourselves out there in a different way, and just providing a different vision for the work that we do. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing. I think that, there's a lot of people out there who probably, for lack of being told otherwise, or the lack of, having accessible information presented to them in a way that they can actually understand and that they actually access it, that says that our work is about taking care of ecosystems and loving ecosystems, and, fighting for all these precious things in our world. They might think that forestry is just about cutting trees, which is not, or that they could never get into forestry because they love trees too much, which is exactly why they should get into forestry, right?
Right.
But I think that one of the real struggles that we have as a community and as a vocation is that I feel like it is the baseline is that our work is misunderstood, right? Like that, like it, if we do nothing, our work is misunderstood. And then, so we then have to, if we don't reach people, I think that that's what people assume that we're like. And so then we have to work extra hard to like provide some more nuance. And part of that, again, is using different methods to reach different people than we reach right now.
Yeah, I gotta agree with you. Your Instagram is actually fantastic. It's how I learned about you in the first place. So,
Oh, thanks.
yeah, I'm in that demographic between 24 and 35.
We have a question in the chat, and then Peter has his hand up. So Margaret has a question. Can you say something about how you are looking at forest ecosystems in the face of climate change?
Oh, I'm sorry, I zoned out for a sec. I was just thinking about what Wolf asked.
You're
Would you
okay.
read that again?
Can you say something about how you're looking at forest ecosystems in the face of climate change?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much to that, right? And I think that one thing that we can get bogged down with a little bit is like the carbon thing, which is a part of it, but it's not the whole thing. What I think about much more is building resilience and decreasing vulnerability. Because, ultimately, this is what I tell people. I'll pretend that you all are just, people on one of my walks or whatever, that like remember that forest's ability to sequester carbon. Carbon is not this like thing in a beaker in on the shelf in a lab. It's like wood, and it's trees, branches and leaves and trunks and all those different things. And forest's ability to sequester carbon is just their ability to photosynthesize, right? Their ability to fix that aerial carbon and turn it into sugars and starches. And so, one thing that's confusing to a lot of people is that they see these studies that say that the best way to, in the short term, the best way to sequester and store the maximum amount of carbon is to just never cut a tree, right? But then the research that we have also suggests that long term, we actually want to be managing our forests for resilient carbon, for their ability long term to be able to photosynthesize, right? And to be able to not be vulnerable to these catastrophic natural disturbances and to do this like risk spreading thing where we help, diversify our forests to prevent them from being dramatically destabilized by all these things that are coming down the pike. So yeah, so I focus less on the carbon thing and more on this idea of resilience. And the way that I explain it to people is that our best tool for forest resilience is number one, reducing vulnerability. Because forests can't do anything if they can't regenerate, if they can't respond to these disturbances. Um, and so that means getting rid of non-native invasive plants. That means reducing deer overpopulations and a variety of other things that compromise forests' ability to just like be forests. And then the other part is like actively diversifying our forests in terms of species composition and in terms of structure. And the cool thing about that, when you talk to people about that, is that that diversification is also in alignment with taking our young, simple forests and managing them to be more like old growth forests, which is something that people are really excited about. So, like, as we're managing forests for these old growth characteristics, we can be at the same time increasing their resilience and decreasing their vulnerability. So, which is, yet another hook that we can, use to help people understand the work that we do. But then, there are other like novel things too, like, doing things like trying to figure out how to do assisted range expansion of some stuff. We have some scientific studies of that. That are going on right now. I have four study plots from the University of Vermont on my own land right now, and some other stuff like that. But I think more accessible is just talking about diversity and reducing vulnerability.
Peter.
Thanks, Ethan. Thank you very much for a very stimulating, very revealing in many ways presentation. This is your enthusiasm for forests and the ecosystems they're in. It really is communicated well. And I'd love to see this come out in other settings. Politics, unfortunately, rears its ugly head a little bit. And as you've traveled around on your book tours and talking with colleagues, friends, and others over the past 2 or 3 years, I bet you've bumped into the folks in the government, Forest Service, the president and his executive order, talking about mature and old growth forests and how we must save them, whatever that may mean. Any reflections, any ways that you can help Americans understand better, other than writing a book that you're doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the mature and old growth thing is very interesting because it's like, the nuance that I like to express is, number one, I did a whole series of videos. I got to check out this old growth forest in Maine, northern Maine, called Big Reed, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy. Yeah, which is like the biggest old growth forest I'd ever been before then was 30 acres. And then when I was on my book tour in Maine, I had a day off, so I got to go to Big Reed and 5,000 acre old growth forest. Pretty remarkable. And so I did a whole series of videos about like what an old growth forest actually is, because most people, who talk about it a lot, including like some people in the social media world who are like influencers who talk about this, have no idea what they are. And so then it's like parsing apart what's an old growth forest, which I would characterize that as a primary forest, right? A forest that's never seen extensive disturbance from like non-indigenous peoples. And then you know parsing that apart from a forest that may have some late successional characteristics, or a forest that's just like not primary but somewhat old, right? And which is different. And so I talk about that a lot, and just try to add some nuance to that discussion. And one thing that I really like to talk about, right, is that the idea that we would want to protect our remaining primary forests. Like, to me, that's such like, of course, we all want to do that. And but that doesn't mean that then anything that we do, to manage a forest, which in many cases may be like managing it for the same characteristics, ecological characteristics that make it so ecologically significant to protect those primary forests. That doesn't mean that those two things are oppositional, right? Which I think sometimes that's what happens, right? Is that people are like, old growth good, so then cutting trees bad, when actually I view, when we actually look at the ecology of old growth forests, which I do a lot, and we're like, these are the conditions that they have, and this is how different they are from the forests that we have now. And we can actually use forest management to make our forests like that centuries sooner than that can naturally occur. That's, to me, is like such an argument for forest management. And that's how like I like to talk about it. But so that's usually what I do. I mean, it's hard because you can get into some hardliners, anti-forest management hardliners. And the way that I try to deal with that is just like with a big smile, and to be like, welcome, this is yeah, like I understand what you're trying to do. And this is what's so cool about what we're trying to do. And I think about it as, I talk about it in a few different ways. Um, Celebrating our work versus defending our work is what I think about a lot. Where it's not about like, this is why forest management should be acceptable. This is why it should be allowed. This is why it's okay. And instead, I'm like, this is why this is beautiful. And this is why this is incredible and like so exciting. And I'm standing in front of this big sugar maple stump, big sugar maple top. And I'm like, isn't this the best? You know? And I think that there is so much, if we frame that stuff in a little different way, uh, we can really engage people, even people who view themselves currently to be hardliners against forest management. And I have a good example of this, which is that there is this organization that is unethical and irresponsible, that cherry picks research and cherry picks experts. They're, pro-forestation organization from Vermont called Standing Trees. And they're the worst. And so content to share these oversimplified narratives that don't represent the totality of the research and the work that's actually being done and being prescribed and all this other stuff. And one of those people, they came on one of these walks with me, and we do this walk and we talk about old growth forests on this job that this logger is working in, and all of these characteristics that we're creating. And what I like to do is we go into the woods, we don't go onto the log landing, we go into the woods, and I make an argument for this work based solely on ecology and just on these conditions that we want to create. And then, we're doing this, and we look at these big legacy trees that are left that are just going to be there forever. And then we end, and everybody feels good about it. And then we end the walk on the log landing. And I say, and as if it couldn't get any better, we are also, while we're doing all of this, producing local renewable resources. Like, what could be better than that? And I had someone from that organization after one of those walks come up to me, and that organization was litigating the state of Vermont for forest management and our Camel's Hump management unit. And they were like, why don't you have the state of Vermont do this like amazing ecological forestry for old growth characteristics like you're doing here? And I just sort of looked at them and I was like, they are. Like that's what the work is that you're suing them for. And it was so powerful because that to me just demonstrated how just changing, reforming the way that we talk about these things fundamentally changes the way that they're perceived. And even, can turn someone who believes themselves to be oppositional to that work into a supporter. And I think that, it can be it's not, you're not going to win over everybody. And some people, it's just not even, worth spending the energy because nothing you could say could ever convince them. But there's a lot of people who just need to be told in the right way, in a way that resonates with their values, in a way that just sort of comes at them and is perceived by them in a certain way with a certain touch.
Well, thanks very much, Ethan. I think this really, brings it, full circle. Some of the things that we've been talking about, and in some ways, I think that the conversations, just starting. This is something that we'll want to carry forward, in different ways, among ourselves, and hope that some of us will continue to engage with you in different ways, reading your book. Following your social media, in other ways. And speaking of your book, where do you suggest that people might find it?
You can get it anywhere. It's an ebook, audiobook, hardcover. I always tell people to, support your local independent bookstore if you can. I've had so much fun on this book tour. I get to hang out in independent bookstores and libraries, and they're just like, some of the best places on earth. So I think in this moment to be an independent bookstore is like pretty radical. And so, go get it there if you can. But anywhere, you can get it anywhere. And so the other thing, can I put in a couple more plugs? So I did a whole hour and a half long webinar about more like getting more specific into my communication strategies that I've used on these public lands for the Forest Stewards Guild. And I believe it's on their website. It's called Communicating Forestry, Ways That Work with Ethan Tapper. And so if you want to check that out, I can also, I don't know if the best way to do this would be to drop them in the chat, Kate, I have 2 story maps that I can share that I made about these projects. I'll just drop them in the chat.
If you want to drop them in the chat, I can also, we'll send up a follow-up email. I will make sure the link to your website with your book and information is in there, as well as the story maps you're sharing and the link to the Forest Stewards Guild. I can put that all in there.
And I can screenshot them for the video when I put it up.
Great, David.
Cool. Yeah, so I just basically, I made these story maps for 2 of these different projects that I was sort of figuring out as I go how to communicate about this stuff. No one ever told me how to do it. I just kind of was like trying stuff. So those 2 story maps kind of speak to that process. And also they're like a little bit of I was worried that after these forest management projects were done, I wasn't going to be there standing in front of them and spreading the nuance. So I wanted to have a link that I could conveniently share that would just tell the story of like what we did and why we did it and stuff like that. So those are both right there.
Awesome.
Great. Well,
thank you.
We're really interesting to see your book tour on your website, and just the list of the places you've been and are still going. Proud to see the Rhode Island Woodland Partnership included on that list. standing out in its own way. And you mentioned that you've been down in this area, but for those who might like to engage with you in person, you'll be coming back down to Southern New England via the Thoreau Farm on March 6th, 2025 for an event.
And I'll probably be doing an event at the Norman Bird Sanctuary.
Awesome. Good.
Sometime in 25 as well.
Cool.
So yeah, you can, on my email list, if you want, you can sign up for, or on my website, you can sign up for my email list if you want to stay apprised of that.
Cool.
Thanks so much for joining us, Ethan. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.